So although this is going to be a very short episode, I figured we could just go right out of the gate and show you something very cool. And what you're looking at here is a little bit of truth behind the bonus areas that are underground in Super Mario Bros. Thanks to NecroRun, who I'll leave a link to in the description down below, we were able to disable the boundaries in almost all the areas of Super Mario Bros. What it reveals down here is that all the bonus areas are connected together. They're all on one map, and if you had the Game Genie code to phase through walls, you could theoretically warp to completely different stages by going through the pipes designated to these specific bonus areas. However, once you get past the very last bonus room, you will not find anything, not even glitches. Instead, Mario just runs infinitely into the void. So you may have noticed that this episode is called Mario/DuckHunt and not Super Mario Bros. And there's a very good reason for that, because we actually want to talk about Duck Hunt in this episode. And the Mario/DuckHunt cartridge is technically one game. Now there isn't much to say about Duck Hunt, I mean there's so little to say about it. But one of the most interesting things that I found here is that if we disable the layer that has the grass and environment, we can actually see the full sprite model for the Duck Hunt dog. And as it turns out, his body actually goes a little further down than the blades of grass suggest, which actually acts as a complete model, minus his feet. And before we say goodbye to Duck Hunt entirely and just make the rest of this entirely dedicated to Super Mario Bros., I also wanted to show off when the Duck Hunt dog jumps behind the grass at the start of every round, you can actually see that his sprite model flashes white on the very last frame of animation. So the shocking show stealer is actually the piranha plants. These guys are exceptionally interesting because of what they do behind the pipes. As you'll see here, when you're away from the pipe, piranhas disappear at the start of the animation and then reappear as they come back up through the pipe. However, if Mario is standing right next to the pipe, the piranhas actually exist in the game the entire time and never disappear until Mario moves away. But by far the most bizarre thing about all this is that if Mario kills a piranha plant with a fire power, that piranha plant will be split in half with its bottom half facing down and its upper half severed and above it. And that piranha will not go away at any time. Another thing that's really interesting too about the piranha plant is that when Mario leaves an underground area, and as you know, a piranha plant will be heading up as you move towards the flagpole, Mario actually touches the piranha plant as he moves through the pipe. Now here's something that requires a long explanation, but I promise you it's very interesting. So at the end of every single level in Super Mario Bros., you might notice that Mario goes inside the castle and then the flag comes up. Well, what if I told you that Mario is actually still in the game even when he quote-unquote goes inside the castle? In fact, he doesn't just stand inside the castle, he's walking inside the castle. Well, what if I also told you that the reason why he's using this animation is because if there wasn't a boundary in front of Mario's way, he would just continue walking. Nah, don't believe me? When Mario jumps over the flagpole and he doesn't activate the stage completion, you might actually notice that he's able to sit on top of a brick block. And if you walk at it from different angles, he also cannot move. This is because this is one portion of this castle model that is an actual brick block and not the castle itself. And in fact, I can even prove this by sliding underneath the stage and breaking the block that's actually connected to this castle. Once you break the block, you can actually see the blue sky backdrop that's part of the game. Now the question is, what happens when Mario completes a stage without this block here? Now I had to be a little bit creative here because if I was to break that block, it's very likely that I would break the ground underneath it as well, because those are also blocks that can be broken. So what I did was I broke enough ground in front of the flagpole to give me a large enough runway to use the Game Genie phase through code, slide through the ground in a sitting position, and as I just get under the block that's connected to the castle, I then jump and break that one block only. Then I complete the stage, and then we can see what happens. And as it turns out, Mario just keeps walking indefinitely and doesn't move on to the next stage. Speaking of walking indefinitely, probably a lot of you have already seen this because you can jump over the flagpole by legitimate means. And what I'm talking about here is what is beyond the castle if you're able to get beyond the flagpole. And a lot of people will just tell you that there's nothing out here, you'll just keep walking indefinitely until the timer runs out and then you die. But what if we turned off the timer? What can we find if we keep running without the fear of death looming over our heads? And a lot like my Super Mario Bros. 3 episode, which I'll leave a link to in the description down below, if you walk forward long enough, the game's programming starts to get a little bit confused. And you can actually start to find different pieces of environment that don't belong here. Like, for example, one chunk of a mushroom platform that Mario himself can actually stand on. You know, we just saw a second ago that Mario's in a walking cycle when he goes inside the castle. Quick little question here is, what does it look like when he does it in the big castles that lead into Bowser's lair? Well, funny enough, the little flag that springs up at the end of every regular stage actually does appear in these bigger castles as well, but the player's not allowed to see it. However, if we remove some of the sprite on this castle, you can actually still see the flag being sprung up like any other stage. And also, what does it look like when we run past the boundaries of the castle goals? Well, actually, what's really cool here is that it has those castle walls that are used in the last few stages of the game. And of course, if you do the same thing that we did last time, you'll also find platforms that you can jump on, as well as some weird graphical glitches. So a moment ago when I was talking about the piranha plants, you actually got a chance to see what Mario looks like when he's going through the pipe vertically. But what does it look like when Mario goes through the pipe horizontally? Does he run in place like he does with the castle? And actually, no, he does not. Instead, once his character's behind the pipe layer, he actually just stands in place until the level is loaded. And now let's talk about the underwater stage. One thing I've always wanted to know as a little kid was, what is beyond this pipe that leads you back to the goalpost? I want to see what goes on further past it. And once again, thanks to the help of Neko Run and Game Genie itself, I was able to get on top of the shoreline and keep on going. And as it turns out, it's just green blocks for miles and miles, with no graphical glitches in sight. Now, we are still not done with the original Super Mario Bros., but I did want to take the time to compare it to its remake on the Super Nintendo. Lots of people criticized me for not having it in my Super Mario Bros. 3 episode, and here on Boundary Break, I take fewer feedback. So anyways, the surprising thing here is that a lot of what was in Super Mario Bros. 1 is ever present here in the remake. Like, for example, all the Piranha Plants behaviors, the flag and the Bowser layers, and Mario running in place when he's behind the castle. So let's talk about what's different. Some of the things that you'll notice here is that the blocks that stop Mario from walking off the stage actually don't exist in this version. Apparently it wasn't needed. And also because the Super Nintendo has an effect where Mario starts to fade to black as he goes inside the doorway, he becomes a straight up silhouette when he's behind the castle. Also, when you kill the Piranha Plants, the top half is now a completely different color from the normal green. In fact, it looks more like its updated version with the red color palette. And before we start doing anything boundary breaking, did anyone else notice that the hammers bounce off of Mario when he's in an invincible state? This is kind of news to me. Yeah, but alright, moving on. First thing I wanted to show you is when we take the axe away from the fight with Bowser, we can actually walk around in the Toad Room. But one of the things you'll also notice here is that apparently Bowser will never jump to give chase to Mario. This is something I've always kind of wondered, but of course since the axe is in the way I never was able to find out. But now I got a definitive answer. Anyways, if we walk around we can see that we have layer priority over Toad, but Toad himself is actually on the sprite layer. He's not in the backdrop. Though there isn't any reason why he couldn't be, the player can't interact with Toad whatsoever, and Mario passes over him exactly like a background object. And another thing too is, can we find anything if we keep running past the end of the level? And although it takes a very, very, very long time to find anything, it seems as though if you run long enough, you will re-encounter with Bowser if you leave him alive. So this is technically the same exact Bowser as the one you're supposed to find normally in the game, which leads to the conclusion that this Toad behind him is the same Toad that you find when you complete the stage. And of course, can we find any boundary breaking elements with the princess herself, Princess Peach? And yeah, actually one thing I found kind of interesting is if you remove the background layer, you can actually see that Princess Toadstool's complete sprite model actually has white pixels that come from each side of her gown. Now I found this particularly interesting because if you look at any sprite sheet that includes Princess Peach from the original Super Mario Bros., most of these guys leave that detail out because those white pixels are camouflaged into the dungeon tiles themselves. So for many people like myself, this is the first time we've ever seen the fully intended image of Princess Toadstool at the end of Super Mario Bros. So first of all, I have to say big thank you to Neko Run who helped me out with these first 3 clips. Could not have gotten this out to you folks without his help, and my god, you're amazing, man. So anyways, you saw that we were in the throne room at the start of the video. Well, that's interesting and everything, but thanks to Neko Run's help, we can actually see what's beyond the throne room. And much to my surprise, there's a completely unique texture that's not even on the cutting room floor. This is completely undiscovered. This isn't used in the game or anything. And this texture runs all the way to the right side of the screen until you hit the very end with the glitchiness. But that's not all there is to see beyond the throne room. No. Apparently, if you go above the throne room, there's something that's a little more familiar. Yes sirree, you got yourself the letter that you see at the end of every world. Who knew that it was actually sitting above the throne room this whole time? So before I pass it off to one of my guests, I want to take another look at another area that could not have been possible without Neko Run. and this is exploring the area before you get onto the airship. Now, what's really interesting here is that the chain that goes from the anchor to the airship is actually really long, and unfortunately you never get to see that when you experience that little cutscene in the game. Now, before NekoRun made this all possible, I actually found out that if you glitched to this cutscene of the game and Mario was a little bit too far ahead, he would die if he touched the side of the screen. That's right, there are death triggers to make sure that if for some reason this ever happened, Mario would be dead.
Thanks to NekoRun, we can now move the screens freely and see areas that are normally locked up tight. For example, the infamous secret door to the warp whistle is in fact up there, as well as the boss room, which is just over to the right. Also outside the walls of the warp whistle room is the dropping spike trap room that's supposed to lead to the boss.
So this in particular, I got wicked excited about. Apparently, in certain maps, especially World 2, there are icons on the map that actually act as level tiles. So the small little pawns in every single one of the pyramids will warp you to a level. Now, some of these will just crash the game. In some cases, you can get lucky and activate a toad house or whatever. But by far, the most interesting thing that can happen out of all this is that it loads a glitchy level. And although all the glitches kind of hide and mask all the objects that are on the screen right now, you can actually feel for what's on the map, such as music blocks, hidden one-up blocks, and in some areas of this little level, secret doors. And these secret doors can sometimes send you to the title screen. This is exactly how I managed to find that airship area that ended up killing Mario, and this happens consistently. So you could essentially label these the secret glitch levels of Super Mario Bros. 3.
The warp whistle has a secret of its own. Because NES games only have 2 layers, Mario and the tornado will normally pass over the border of the map. But if we remove the background layer, you can see that the developers created sprite mock-ups of the border for the tornado to pass under.
Now we're going to check out the famous pyramid level of World 2. If you can recall, you're supposed to just go inside the door, and if you continue jumping up, the screen is locked. So instead of the screen following Mario, Mario just instead goes off screen. However, with this hack, that lock is removed, and now we can see the full texture of this area, which is really impressive. In fact, some VG maps of this level is considered inaccurate now that we can see this in full. But what's also interesting is that if we use a walkthrough walls code, we can see even more of this area than the game intended. For one thing, we can see this pyramid structure in full, move past that, find a bonus room that's also in this level, go past that, and then eventually find our way to the goal of the level.
While not much is hidden behind the background layers of Super Mario Bros. 3, it turns out that the objects moving through pipes like piranha plants and Mario himself reveal a strange masking texture on the sprite layer when the background layer is removed. As to why this is the case, perhaps the pipes themselves can't obscure the object properly, so they had to use that masking texture. That's all I can think of.
You know, speaking of that castle level that we just looked at for World 2, when we break the boundaries of this particular stage, there's a lot to see. For example, if we take Mario through the left here, we can see the outside of the castle with complete block textures. And if we take him over to the right, we can see a whole bunch of empty areas as well as the boss room. This level in particular is just really surprising to me because while a lot of areas have stuff outside of the boundaries, none of it's usually as intentional as something like this.
With the move anywhere on the map code, the player can for some reason scroll the warp whistle area. Normally, if the map is not intended to scroll, Mario will end up on the other side of the same screen he was on. But here, there's an absurd number of screens to scroll through. And if we speed the game up 6,400 times its regular speed, we can actually reach the glitchy screen just before recycling back to the original warp screen.
Hold on there, Andy. I think I see a beta element on this screen. Over there, there's an unused building sprite that blips on and off. That's pretty neat.
Now here's another little interesting tidbit. Apparently the Princess Peach that's on the letter is on the sprite layer. Now that's cool and everything, but now when we remove the background, which is the letter, you can actually see that there's a white border that's also on the sprite layer for Princess Peach, except for the crown. The crown keeps going where the white rectangle ends.
In the matching game, you can see that Mario is always a part of the background layer, while Toad is on the sprite layer, and the answer as to why is revealed when we remove the background layer. You see? Turns out Toad is on the sprite layer because he needs the background layer to fill in some missing colors in his sprite.
Hey, not bad, Beta, but I got one more thing to add here. Now, you folks might remember a minute ago when A+ started talking about the masking layer for the tornado. Well, that technique is used again here in the matching game. See, when you remove the sprite layer, it actually removes the two sides of the border that covers up the slides, which allows us to see the slides from all the way from the left side of the screen to the entire right. Hey, did you guys ever want to know what was outside of the boss rooms in the airships? Yeah, let's find out. So as it turns out, the boss rooms for the Koopalings are tucked right in the upper left-hand corner, so there's nothing behind or above it, but below and to the right of it is complete darkness. So technically nothing as well. But what you can see here is that the textures for the boss room continue further down than the player is allowed to see. And you also get an idea of what the spatial awareness is for the boss room when you go there. Now, I have to take this moment to give underwhelming answers to some of the biggest questions that plagued me as a kid, like what's beyond this break block pyramid? And as it turns out, it's pretty much nothing. It's just more desert ground to walk on before you reach a glitchy wall. Pretty much every level in Super Mario Bros. 3 has leftover space that ends with a glitchy wall.
Son of a bitch.
So one thing that I need to reiterate one more time is that there's just two layers to an NES game. There's the background layer and there's the sprite layer. Now obviously the sprite layer is usually reserved for things that are active towards the player, like enemies, bosses, and the character themselves, and so everything else is just like a giant painting that the character interacts with. Well, for some reason on this one map, if you remove the background layer, you can see that this one cloud is actually on the sprite layer. It also hides Mario if he moves under it, which is really unusual. So now that we understand the concept of layers, let's introduce something that's a little bit strange. In one of the last areas of the game, there is a dark area with a spotlight that shines over Mario. Now you would think that if you just remove the sprite layer, it would reveal the entire map, but no, that is not the case. Instead, removing the sprite layer just removes the corner pieces that makes up the circle pattern, and what you're left with is a square spotlight. Also, if we were to move Mario past the boundaries, we can see that there's skulls that are brown. It's pretty clear that it's sharing the border color that usually surrounds the map. Now here's a scene of Rocky Wrench in slow motion without the background layer to cover up his sprite. And the reason for this is so you can see that there is no lower body to the Rocky Wrench. There's a special texture when you land on the Rocky Wrench, and when the Rocky Wrench falls through the ground, you have a better look at his weird little tail that is only on the screen for like a half a second.
In a previous scene, we explained that the spotlight effect is somehow in the background layer. However, with the move anywhere on the map code and going through the left side of the screen, the player will load the invisible tiles from the secondary map of World 8 when the hand grabs Mario and you either win or lose. The dark area map will glitch and remove the dark effect, revealing the entire map. That's pretty cool if you ask me.
And of course, we have to do a giant tour of what it looks like inside of Bowser's castle as we go from the far left of one screen all the way to the right. Now the far left was the trap room, but as we make our way further through, you can see it's pretty much all the rooms that lead up to Bowser himself. Now I have to admit, I've seen this quite a few times in all the dungeon castles, but they don't often share space with each other if the background or the tiles look completely different, like it did at the start of this map. Now, there is a little Easter egg in Super Mario World. If you wait a couple seconds with the regular boos, they do a little silly face with their tongue. But a little tidbit that's a lot more obscure is that if you wait a really long time with the big boo, you may try to peek every 17 seconds or so and try to see if Mario is there. Now, this game does use layers, but unfortunately, if a sprite is on a sprite, removing the sprite layer is only going to remove all the sprites. But thanks to Lux over smwcentral.net, he was able to remove the hands off of the big boo, and so now you can see his eyes without any obstruction whatsoever. So you can remove layers in Super Mario World, and of course, when you do that, you start to see things that the developers use to mask other things. So you just saw me cross this bridge here with the Cheep Cheep, and if we remove some of the key layers here, you can see that there's a blue square here that the Cheep Cheep goes into. And you know, that's a little disappointing. It's all on the same layer as the Cheep Cheep, so much like the Big Boo, we had to go inside the ROM itself to remove the blue square just to see what happens to the Cheep Cheep that the developers mask. And if we slow down the footage here, you can see that the Cheep Cheep starts off looking one direction and ends with the image flipped, as well as the palette of the Cheep Cheep changing for only a few frames. And that's not the only thing hidden by layers. The Lakitu, for example, always has a body underneath the clouds, but unfortunately, since once again, it's all on a sprite layer, it had to be modified outside of the game. But we pulled it off for you. Here you go. This is what a Lakitu looks like without his cloud, which isn't too different from when you smack on its head and it falls through it. But there's also a Lakitu that goes through a pipe, and if you paid close attention to how the Lakitu looked like without the cloud, you can see that the person that did the art on this one didn't care as much about making sure that the arms connected really well with the body. Again, slowing down the footage, when you see him throw a Spiny, you can see that it almost looks as though his arms and his head are placed over the original body instead of being organically connected to it. In fact, you can still see the upper limbs of the original Lakitu underneath the new limbs, which made me curious about the Fishin' Boo, and unfortunately there isn't anything to see underneath that cloud. You'll see that his neck pretty much just stops about where you'd think it would, which makes sense because you can't step on a Fishing Boo's head and take the cloud from him. Now let's talk about maps. The first thing that I noticed is that there's this border here that can be removed as a layer, and it'll show a little bit more of the map, and I was really intrigued by this. I saw a landmass over on the left near the green switch. Now don't get too excited, I very quickly realized what was going on here. The borders of Super Mario World are actually hiding the opposite portion of the map. For example, that landmass you just saw on the left there is actually the far right side of the same map. The image just repeats itself. And then when I started to figure that out, I started to think, wait a second, the sub-maps do something very similar. Well, at least they have to, because when I remove the border there, I can see other sub-maps from whatever sub-map I'm on. So we activated the map scrolling for the sub-maps, and as a result you can see how one giant map holds all the sub-maps together, and it's really cool. Depending on which sub-map you're on, all the other maps will mimic that color palette, and as a result I saw something that we're not supposed to see. See, the special sub-map normally has a pitch black background, but as a result of copying the color palette from Yoshi's Island, we can see that this pitch black background is in fact a regular ground texture that was just made to look pitch black. Alright, let's start talking about doors because it gets really interesting here. As you're going to see with this building, as we move up, the castle walls seem to immediately end. But what's really interesting is that up here, there's another door. Or should I say, it's the same door as before. See, the way that Super Mario World works is that sometimes there will be 2 screens and sometimes there will be 1 screen. And if you expand something to 2 screens, things start to just repeat itself. And so this door is just a repeat of the door that we were just at. The exit Boo doors follows a completely different set of rules though. As you start to move up, the doors just kind of come with you. And also by removing the layers here, you can see what that building would look like without the doors open or the exit sign. And if you thought it was fun seeing what the top of the buildings look like, I also want to show you what some of the stages look like in the Forest of Illusion when you just move right past that bottom screen. And just like anything else, the tree line immediately stops. I don't know what to tell you. It gives me such a trip to see this stuff. And here's one more example of everything we just talked about with the bonus room. Again, the border just immediately stops, and also the item blocks start to come back onto the second screen. Okay, how about we start looking at stuff that is actually outside of the boundaries that you're not supposed to see, but is not an example of saving resources. Well, to start with, on the Reznor boss stage, if we go below the lava line, you can see that there's a stone brick line. That's pretty much used in all the boss battle rooms for the Koopalings. And so it might be doing the same effect that we saw earlier where screens repeat itself when you start to move up or down. And so the bricks in the Reznor area might be rested above, just out of bounds. And then we have an enemy that is completely unused and would be never seen by the player by normal means. In the stage that can lead you to the green switch, if you were able to get rid of the auto-scrolling and move Mario all the way to the right, for a brief moment you would see a buzzy beetle trapped in the wall who then falls through the environment and is never to be seen again. What he's doing there? I'm not sure. I guess the developers knew that he was never going to be seen by the player anyway, or maybe it was just an oversight by the developers in general. But either way, it never affects the gameplay. All right, let's talk about a couple things hidden by layers. Now, you might remember these pipes here here that move up and down, it's kind of interesting how they pull this effect off, because the lip of the pipe is the only thing that's really panning up and down. If you remove that layer of the pipe, you're gonna see that how it extends is that it ends up putting in chunks of the pipe underneath, making it look a lot more jerky if you remove the lip. And then we got the blarg. Now this guy's really cool. He kind of peeks out of the lava really quick, and then when he sees that the coast is clear, he tries to attack Mario. Removing the layer of the lava though can show you that the eyes are not connected to anything at all. It's instead completely separated, and that the blarg monster doesn't really have too much going on underneath the lava. Though if you compare the original version with the unhidden version, you can see there's a lot more pixels to the monster that's not normally seen. And then we got the piranha plants. These guys are always so interesting to talk about on Boundary Break for some reason. And in Super Mario World, if you keep away from the pipe, the piranha plants keep going back and forth, and there's no interruption whatsoever. But that classic Mario move, if you're right next to the pipe, you might remember that the piranha plant doesn't attack Mario, and when that happens, the image of the piranha plant is removed entirely. Meanwhile, these variants over here have a different property. When they go inside the pipe, their animation is completely frozen until they come back out of the pipe. And then there's Lemmy Koopa, who goes in and out of pipes. Now, again, there isn't too much to see outside of the fact that he has no torso underneath, except for the fact that every single time he switches to a different pipe, there is a single frame where you can see his entire body. All right, now let's move on to a mixed bag of weird oddities. Now, people who have done Mario Maker before probably are very familiar with this, but it's not entirely common in Super Mario World. Here's an example of a stage where you go into a sub area within the stage, and this is that sub area that you would normally go to. Now, when you go outside the other pipe in the sub area, it takes you to this opposite side in the main stage. But if you were to move Mario through the main stage and just skip the sub area entirely, you can see that after a little bit of distance here, you would find the pipe that you would normally come out of, showing that this entire main stage is completely connected together. Also, this is something that you don't get to see typically. If you throw an enemy in the lava, there's a lava effect, and if Mario touches the lava in a normal game, Mario simply dies immediately. But there is a water property to the lava. If you were fully invincible and you were to dip yourself in the lava like here, you can see the water effect, indicating that Mario could have been able to swim in lava at one point. And here's some various weird stuff with all the fortress animations. Nearly all the fortresses have a separate layer for the door, and underneath that layer is a gray version of the door. And despite the fact that it's only shown for one scene, every single fortress has a sprite for the dug up dirt underneath. Also, if you were able to take control of Mario during these scenes, a lot of the stuff in these scenes obey the laws of gameplay. Like for example, if you don't move the egg over into the spot, it never triggers the scene where it says thank you. But even better than that, I want to show you this scene right here where every time you push the button, it makes the noise as if you've activated the button. Here, take a listen. Alright, we're almost at the finish line here, so let's talk about a couple of more things before we move on to Bowser. The giant wooden beams. If you take a look at them from the very back end of them, you can see that for a couple of frames, the status box shows up right at the tail end of the beam. I asked Lux why this would be the case, and he said it was because they're both on the same layer in the game. The wooden beam ends up using some vertical scrolling, and as a result of scrolling too far down, it ends up showing some of the status bar. And inside the Choco Ghost House, there seems to be a beam here. It has collision, and for some weird reason, it doesn't have correct sprites, so you get this glitchy mess to represent it. Anyways, moving on to Bowser's castle, I'm going to show you two things. One is, here's Bowser flying around his castle. I know you can see that when a lightning flashes, but this is just a nice, easier way to see him in full and just soak it in for a bit. Also, there's a separate layer for the Bowser sign for some reason, which likely indicates that that Bowser sign didn't exist there to start with and it was added in post. You can also see this for yourself if you were to complete a stage, but I just wanted to take a moment to kind of illustrate the fact that it's weird that they let this in, especially when it accidentally gets removed whenever a save screen pops up. And then there's the face off with Bowser himself. Now Bowser is attached to his clown copter, so removing layers isn't going to show you anything too interesting there, but Princess Peach is not. Now you may remember this scene where Peach is looking absolutely hideous and throws Mario a mushroom. Well, if you remove the layer during this scene, you can see that the clown copter is on a separate layer, and you can see a little bit more of her white belt that surrounds the torso. And lastly, after you rescue Princess Peach, there's a fun little tidbit here. Princess Peach will walk to you indefinitely until she reaches you. So normally Mario walks to her and the gap is bridged pretty quickly, but in this episode we're gonna make her walk to us. And also Mario's blush is on a separate layer, so if we move Mario through Princess Peach, you can put Mario's face on Princess Peach's body. Fun little fact. Hey, paisanos! I'm your host, Shesez, and welcome to episode 103 of Boundary Break. And in case you're new here, we go out of the boundaries of any video game to try to explain developer techniques, or sometimes find left-behind content. And for this remake episode, we had a returning animator, Michael Chin, aka Metal Penguin, make an all-new intro. So sir, thank you so much for the contribution. You can find links to him down below. And for those of you who don't know why the original episode is gone, I will explain that at the end of this episode. With that said, enjoy some new content and new commentary for Super Mario 64. And by the way, I'm going to be doing both Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64, and as you can see here, on the Nintendo DS as well. And here's something that wasn't in the original episode. Luigi's Casino. Now, normally the camera is locked in a fixed position, and you're not allowed to explore this area whatsoever. However, by taking the camera anywhere we want, we can see that the area itself is very limited, as well as excellent resource management. You might notice that nothing is modeled on the other side of these slot machines. And we get a good look at what happens to Toad when he walks off screen. But that's not all. We can also explore any other minigame that uses 3D geometry, like that completely pointless Yoshi minigame with the flower. One thing that I never even took the time to notice is that he's sitting on a bridge. And by manipulating the camera, you can see that the only thing that is rendered here is the bridge. Everything else is just a 2D image that's attached to the HUD. Also, you might remember that waiting area with the Yoshi from multiplayer. And once other players start joining your lobby, different color Yoshi start walking onto the screen. Well, if no players join the lobby and you take the camera outside of its intended boundaries, you can see that the other three Yoshis are there at all times and bunched up together in the same position. So let's kick the ball back over to the Nintendo 64 version and show you a cool little trick that's not used in the DS version. Back in the day, 3D graphics had very limited technology, and so developers always had to come up with interesting tricks with the resources and the limitations that they had. And one of my favorites is swapping out character models depending on how far away the character is. See, back in the day, you were all playing Super Mario 64 on standard definition televisions and a boatload of aliasing. And so without the standard of HD, developers were able to put more on screen by having a low poly version of your own character. This technique in Super Mario 64 isn't used in a whole lot of areas though. I've been able to find it on a couple examples like Yoshi and King Babam, but the transformation isn't quite as charismatic as it is over here with Mario. And since we're in the main area of the castle, why don't we do a zoom out of it to show you just what it looks like all in one shot. And fun little fact here, you might notice that in official player's guides back in the day, there were screenshots that were very similar to this. And this is because Nintendo themselves would in-house use a camera system just like this to be able to supply those images. And hey, what the heck, why don't we also show you what it looks like in the DS version as well. It almost looks the same, doesn't it? But there is something slightly off. And that's because in the DS version of Super Mario 64, the devs went above and beyond and created special rooms just for when Mario goes through the door. Each of these rooms have their own special texture to try and represent the area that's going to load into. So, like for example here, you can see the blue on the ceiling and the green on the walls. This is because it's supposed to represent the outside of the castle. And I gotta say, for something that I thought would be really boring, it ended up being one of my favorite parts of this episode. The menus of Super Mario 64 and DS use all sorts of fun developer techniques, one of which I want to show you here with the heads on the DS version. The backdrops that they use behind the heads are in a 3D space, and so when you manipulate the camera, you can see the entire texture moving around in a white void. And the logo for the 64 version is a fully 3D model. If we take the camera behind that logo, you can see that there's no modeling, though there is one untextured face right here. And I also managed to find an extracted model from VGResource.com. And although the colors are off, I could stop to show you all this without worrying about the game transitioning to Mario's face. It's kind of amazing how many unique textures are added to something that's only on there for a brief second. Unique textures are used all over the menus of Super Mario 64. Like the moving blocks when you go to select a file, all the back faces of all of these menus have unique textures on the back. I honestly would have just imagined they would have duplicated the same texture because I don't feel like anybody would really notice. But it's really neat to see that dedication, especially on the big yellow one that usually never moves. as this is a texture that's completely unique and never seen by the player. And alternatively, on the DS version, they use this cool water effect in the background, and the effect is pulled off by contorting the two images to give a ripple effect. But that's not all. If we go back to the 64 version, when you go to select a stage, you might notice that all the stars are 3D. Well, what's really cool about that is that the white void that they rest in also has a floor level. And it becomes really easy to figure out where that floor is because the shadows of those stars drop down on them, something that, again, is never seen by the player. Now here's something I didn't really get a good chance to do in the original episode. I want to do a side-by-side comparison of both the DS version and the 64 version and to see if they do anything really different. One of the things that I did cover on the original episode was these Monty moles for the 64 version, and back then I made the observation that they quote-unquote disappear, only to find out later from other sources that they don't really disappear, they are warping to different spots, and making it seem like there's 4 Monty moles on screen. And the truth of this becomes way more apparent when you slow this down. But on the Nintendo DS, it's a lot different. You'll notice that when the Monty moles go underneath the ground, they just kind of stay in a stationary position until they're ready to spring back up. Now this is something I was more expecting in the original 64 version, and you're gonna find this lack of care across the board. Not because the developers were lazy or anything, it's just that they didn't have to do this anymore. Like for example, in the 64 version, when Mario would jump through a painting, he would immediately get called out. But in the DS version, it's a totally different story. The characters just continue falling down. That's of course until the character's loaded into the stage. And Lakitu is handled way differently between the two games. On the 64 version, all the clouds are just 2D textures. And it also reveals something else, which is that the Lakitus do not have legs or anything outside of the shells that you can normally see in the game. The Lakitus in the DS version, however, are a bit extra. Their clouds are not only 3D polygons, but inside those clouds is also a weird cone that has duplicate images of the mesh that is used for the Lakitu. In fact, cones are used all the time in Super Mario 64 DS. It's a technique that is used in a lot of Nintendo DS games. And the reason why this technique is used is because developers can place these objects on top of things without ever having to worry that it hovers off of the ground or measures correctly so it doesn't clip through it. Instead, they decide that they're going to overdo it on purpose and make no mistakes at all. It's kind of great when you think about it. And as you can see, that technique was used on the Womp King, which also had an extracted model. So what I ended up doing here was ripping apart the model so that you can see the entire crown model without any obstruction or having to have your face right up against it. So why don't we start talking about birds in Super Mario 64? Birds are always a great subject on the show Boundary Break, because usually they're used as background elements and you never get a good close-up on them. Sometimes they can be really detailed, and sometimes they can be so hilariously low detailed. In Super Mario 64, it falls somewhere in the middle. In the original 64 game, they were full 3D models with white bellies and yellow beaks. However, in the DS version, for whatever reason, they got rid of the white bellies, gave them their own head, and the blue on their bodies has more of a gradient effect as it keeps going down different darker tones. Also in the DS version, the castle is completely modeled in the backside. If you were to take the camera through the grassy geometry, you'd see details that are not present to the player nor ever present in the original game, which is pretty awesome. But let's see what the castle and everything else in this area looks like all the way up in the sky. So let's take a quick break from the side-by-side comparison to show you what's unique to each game. Over in the 64 version, there's a spawning point for the flame textures. You can see this for yourself when you're playing the game, but if you look up in the first Bowser level, you can see a little red dot way off in the distance. This is where all the flames spawn from, and then get warped to these positions. So let me just take the camera right on over here and show you where it is exactly. It's pretty much underneath and near the very end of the level. But meanwhile, over in the Super Mario 64 DS, Dire Docks is a landscape that's completely unique to this game. Normally the large textures act as walls that keep the player out, and outside those walls there's nothing to see. However, in Super Mario 64 DS, the environment continues on. Obviously this was put in place to make the area seem more organic, because in those very rare moments in which the player could launch themselves high enough to see outside of those walls, the developers want you to believe that there's something more to it. Also, in the hidden area in Hazy Maze Cave, the waterfall at the very end for the original Super Mario 64, it had like a big white texture to represent the outdoors, because if you had gone that way you would end up outside. Although funny enough, in Super Mario 64 DS, it's the entrance to Hazy Maze Cave that has a white texture underneath the pool. And if you were to ask me which one I think would make more sense, I'd say that the original game made a little more sense because you could actually see the white behind the waterfall since it was a little more transparent. Whereas here with the pool in DS, you would never see this. But anyways, let me do a couple of viewer requests. As always, you can find out what the next episode I'm covering is on Twitter. And that's also where you can leave some viewer requests for the upcoming episodes. So if you're interested in that, by all means, you can follow me there. But yeah, one of the things that was really interesting that I didn't even think to check out was someone had mentioned when you unlock a new character in Super Mario 64 DS, the minimap shows them without a hat before they pop out. And I don't really know why this is the case, but yeah, if you take the camera on the other side of the door, you can see that the characters start off with no hat before they eventually come out. Also, since we're in this proximity, I can show you what it looks like when you swap out the characters. Also, something that's kind of weird, if you try to unlock Wario with Yoshi, which is something you can't do by normal means in the game, there's unique dialogue for Yoshi in Wario's stage. The boss makes a comment about how Yoshi doesn't have his own mustache. It's kind of interesting. And also a couple people on Twitter want to know what happens exactly with the white room on the DS version. They want to know how it is pulled off. And if you pull the camera out, you can see that it's actually a small room. A small room in a black void, so the contrast is really good here. And I believe you can see this for yourself if you go into look mode and tilt the camera in certain ways. At least that's what happened with my experience. But anyways, let's do a couple more side-by-side comparisons. In the Baba Battlefield, if you haven't activated the cannon yet in the original 64 version, you'll see that there is no cannon underneath. It truly is just that one cannon that's resting on top. However, in the DS version, they handle things a lot differently. The cannon that is in use is a dummy cannon, and you'll find the true cannon underneath that cannon. So by clipping through the boundaries and going inside of that cannon, you can actually use the cannon within the cannon, and you can see the inside of the cannon while you're in the cannon. Wow. All right, what am I even saying right now? Let's just fire this thing off. And wow, by chance of firing myself out of the cannon, I also found objects stored underneath the stage. Wasn't expecting that. A little bit of a bonus boundary break right there. Yeah, let's look at this one last side-by-side comparison. The mansion level starts off with you jumping into a cage and shrinking down to the size of the mansion itself. And here you can get a nice good close-up of how it looks before you jump into the stage. Funny enough, I would argue that the detail in the 64 version is slightly better than the DS version because there's some weird graphical glitches going on here. And in fact, speaking of graphical oddities, you can find something way out of bounds. Far below the rec room area is a try that has a distorted texture on it. And the distance between this try and the stage is enormous. Honestly, it would take quite a while just to drop down there. But going back to the castle garden, let's do a zoom out of what that looks like on the DS version, just to show you that there isn't any hidden environment like there was for Dire Docks. And lastly, I want to share an experiment with you. In Super Mario 64 DS, you're not allowed to fight Bowser with the other characters. So I wanted to show you what would happen if we took Wario outside of the boundaries, got him all the way through Bowser's last stage, defeated Bowser with Wario, and see how the game would react. Well, the first thing that seems to happen here is that Mario spawns behind Wario and doesn't even play out that animation where he's supposed to have the wing cap and fly around the stage. And then after that, Princess Peach is saved, with Mario nowhere to be found. And so you gotta ask yourself, who does Princess Peach reward if Mario's not around? Well, you might find the answer to be a little bit messed up, and I think chances are Wario's probably feeling the exact same mood.
We have to do something special for you.
So the first thing I want to talk about is a test map that is still inside the game. Now there are a few things that you will not see in the main game, like for example this soccer ball here. But the star of the show on this map is that over to the right there is a trampoline stew, which you may not know what a trampoline stew is. Well, in the context of Boundary Break, all we have here is a giant oval looking monster with an eye on the top of his head and a horn for a butt. And he shows up incredibly briefly during this scene. In fact, if you don't turn the camera fast enough, you may never see him at all. Spraying him with water will freeze him in place, and jumping on his eyeball will kill him and also give you 1 coin. But now I'm going to turn it over to Digino Gaming to give you a little more information on this creature.
Stompin' Stew, known as Hinokuri 2 in the game's files, is an unused enemy that could actually be seen in footage when the game was shown off at Nintendo's Space World event in 2001. Still within the game's data are 3 separate forms for Stew, which we'll call the Skull form, Head form, and Headless form. The Skull form has protective skull headwear that cracks as the player damages it. The Head form seems to be how the creature would naturally look, and the Headless form is the model without the mushroom-like coating on its torso. Stompin' Stew lives up to its fan-given name, stomping around while shaking the ground, spawning Strollin' Stews and eggs with goobles in them. Researchers at the cutting room floor have noted how the 2 in the creature's name likely indicates that there's 2 versions of the enemy. There's even references to both Hinokuri and Hinokuri 2 in the game, with the original Hinokuri being linked to a boss battle event. This could mean the original Stompin' Stew was a boss, or at least part of a boss battle.
Much appreciated, and now we're going to do a zoom out of the entire test map. So let's talk about how the flood works. Now that water effect in the game looks really nice, doesn't it? How do they pull that off, you might be wondering? Well, if you take the camera over on its side, it becomes painfully clear. The water effect for the flood is in fact a series of water bubbles. And those water bubbles just move really, really fast so that from the perspective that you're always forced to look at, flood looks freaking awesome. But here, you can see that there's no 3D effects at play. It's just simply a bunch of 2D textures being thrown around to give you the visual illusion of streaming water. It's really fascinating. Areas of Super Mario Sunshine, there's places that are barred off. And surprisingly, unlike most video games that you'll see covered on this show, taking the camera outside the boundaries is not that disappointing. Now, there isn't like a new town or anything quite like that, but there's low poly geometry for the other levels in the game just outside the boundaries here, and that's a little to be expected. If you get to certain heights in this level, you might be able to see that for yourself. But what's really cool here is if you take the camera and point it back at the stage that you're playing in and start to pan the camera out, it looks just the way it does when you look at it from other areas of the game. Then of course there's this area here where PD Piranha can show up later in this level, and unfortunately just around the bend there isn't too much to see. I guess taking the camera where it's not supposed to go will have varied results. And then sometimes going out of bounds will show you something that you're just simply not meant to see at all. Like in almost every single bonus stage, all the way in this position right here, you can almost certainly find these white squares. What purpose does it serve? Well, it remains to be seen, honestly. But almost consistently throughout the board, there are some exceptions, you will find this white square. And it's not double-sided, so if you were to try to look for it from where you're standing, playing the game vanilla, you're not going to see it. You'd only be able to see it from down below, and unfortunately, it's already past the death barrier. Then you want to talk about a really obscure thing that is inside the map that you can't really see that well. In episode 4 of Pinna Park, there is a set of bananas far, far in the sky. This set of bananas was discovered by a young man named Go-Go, who in his discovery video would like the name of the bananas to go by Go-Go Bananas. So from here on out, we're gonna call them the Go-Go Bananas. And standing in this spot here, which you normally can't because there's a barrier between you and the park, if Mario were to keep rising in place at this spot, you would eventually bump into the bananas. Now the bananas behave in a way just like any other fruit that hangs from a tree. It's placed in a very specific spot, and then if Mario interacts with it with a water hose or whatever else that allows them to be knocked off the tree, the bananas will then fall. What they're doing up here, we're never gonna know, but it is one of the most bizarre little facts that I have the deepest thanks for Go-Go for finding. Now, through deductive reasoning, I found out something pretty cool. See, Mario walks inside this shop, and then if you have the camera panned out, you can see a lot of Delfino Plaza's items far down below, but the plaza itself is missing. But I was able to extrapolate exactly where this was in conjunction with the island itself, and decided to try to take Mario in that exact point, but outside the shop itself. And I gotta say, I was really happy with the results, because taking Mario all the way up here is gonna show you that he can suddenly stand in place in the middle of nowhere. But even better than that, this proves that this is where the shop is, because if you look at who now shows up whenever Mario stands in this spot, you can see the same shopkeepers that were inside of that shop itself. And the same can be said for the other indoor areas as well. It's almost always directly above wherever you enter the door. Great example of this is the box busting minigame, and why it's such a great example is because once you get up here, you can see all the boxes, including the guy that runs the minigame. And that's not even the best of what you can find out of bounds, honestly. One of the most bizarre discoveries was in Pinna Park, and once again on a very specific episode, if you take the camera down below in this very spot near the carousel, you'll find this unique cardboard character named Cug. Looks just like a Goomba here, and turning the camera around on this thing, we'll show you that it has a backside as well, which is super odd. Normally, anything like this wouldn't have a backside, but Cug has some special care and attention. What he's doing here, once again, that can't be really explained, but I will turn it over to Did You Know Gaming to tell you everything that we know so far.
This character is named Cug after the title of the files associated with it. The name Cug may be some sort of play on Kuribo, the Japanese name for Goombas. The file names within Sunshine often have a single letter suffix, meaning a letter is added to the end of a word. So the name Cug could simply be Ku, an abbreviation of Kuribo, and then a G. Anyone who's already seen an episode of Boundary Break will know that characters and objects in games are often placed out of bounds when they aren't in use. Since Cug is underground, it's possible the developers were doing tests with Cug and simply forgot to delete it after testing. It's also possible a developer left Cug here on purpose as an Easter egg for folks like Shesez.
Thank you very much, guys, and now I'm going to show you a close-up of Delfino Island from far away. This is from the landing strip where Mario first starts his adventure. Now it's time to talk about Piantissimo. As you know, there's this Pianta here in Mario Sunshine that looks a little bit off. I'm sure a lot of you can't quite put your finger on it. He blends in incredibly well with the rest of the Piantas. Okay, I'm lying. But anyways, here's what he looks like without his mask on. Thanks to modelsresource.com, we were able to take the model of this character and simply remove the helmet from his head, giving you a very clear look at what he's supposed to look like in his human form. But actually, that's not the only thing the characters are hiding. Like, for example, the Nokis here are all shell-based creatures, and if you spray them with water, they hide inside their shells. Sometimes, by moving the camera inside the shell, you can see the limbs shrunken down. The head, the arms, everything. But unlike other games, there's no consistency to this, because other times, if you take the camera inside, all you'll see is just a couple of tries of geometry here, showing that all the limbs have been reduced to a size value that's not visible to the player. And these aren't the only characters that are hiding more than you can see. In Noki Bay, there's a level where you fight a giant eel, and the only extent you really have to engage with this eel is that you spray its eyes to get rid of some of the goop that's in it. But in truth, there's a lot more to this character model than you would normally see. First of all, taking the camera from this angle can show you that there's an entire outer body that's barely ever seen by the player, and then taking the camera inside the body itself will show that it has a gut. If you look up here, that's where the eyes are, and you're seeing the inside of the mouth. Looking down, you can see the uvula, which then gets you to the throat, and now we can go from the throat to the stomach. It's very clear that at a certain point, the developers wanted you to get inside this stomach, but I imagine it was probably just a little too traumatizing to put into a kid's game. And then of course, there's the Noki Bay book, one of the greatest mysteries in out of bounds content. See, inside the Noki Bay bottle, there's this door that never opens. And if you take the camera inside the door, you can see the book. Now, nobody really has all the answers for this, but I'm gonna pass it over to Did You Know Gaming so they can talk about as much as we do know about this book.
It's true that no one really knows what the book's original purpose was, but we do at least know a few details. The door and book models are actually part of the level geometry and aren't categorized as objects or items. The book itself doesn't even have any collision programmed, which you can find out for yourself by using a glitch to clip by the door, or by hacking. It's speculated the book was once part of the mission, but the mission was changed to a red coin challenge during development. That said, there's no supplementary evidence for this. Fans have said the track that plays in the level is titled Book in the Bottle, implying the book was once an important part of the mission. However, the actual title for the song is Sky and Sea, in both the English and Japanese soundtracks.
Thanks, guys. Now let's talk about PD Piranha. As you know, this character attacks by vomiting brown sludge, and how that effect is pulled off in game is really interesting. Taking the camera just below the ground level will show you that the initial splurge of brown goo in fact clips through the floor, and then the mold for that goo still exists for a little while after it's gone through the floor, and instead of continuously going downward, it stops and it shrivels up inside of itself. You can still see a tiny line of where the geometry still is, as it all gets sucked into each other. Now with that said, let's round off this scene with a zoom out of the boss area itself, showing you that the entire area is in a closed off prism, but outside of that black prism is a daytime sky dome. Alright, now on to a viewer request. As always, you can follow me here on Twitter if you ever want to give me a suggestion for an episode that I'm working on, or you can always just send me a message telling me what games you want me to cover. But anyways, people want to know, what does it look like when Mario's inside the pipes in Delfino Plaza? As a lot of you already know, when you go down into the pipes, the camera doesn't really follow Mario. It keeps you on the outside looking at a silhouette of Mario who's now running through the sewers. Well, if you take the camera all the way down, you'll see that the model for Mario still exists. And if you take the camera down low enough, you can see the entire model, in fact. But the The environment that he runs around in is just a flat piece of geometry, and without the special filters to make that outline really bold, it's really hard to see that original flat surface down here. And speaking of filters, the game loves these things. For example, there is a heat wave filter that is played in front of you at all times. Now, if we were to take the camera outside of Mario's view, truthfully, this is what you're supposed to see. A giant rectangle that represents how the heat wave effect is pulled off in the game. So while you're running around, Mario has a giant screen following him in front of his face at all times. It's kind of creepy when you think about it. And a similar effect is also used whenever there's a shadow cast over Delfino Island. There's also something very peculiar about this version of Super Mario Sunshine. As many of you know, in the Switch version of the game, the developers accidentally put back in dev cubes that had certain functions for some of the floodless areas. Well, similarly, if the game isn't running right, you can see a prism that surrounds Mario whenever he's supposed to have the outline effect when he's hidden behind environments. Now, I asked a lot of people if they knew exactly what this was. Nobody had a good answer, even the Super Mario Sunshine pros, who really get into the nit and gritty of this game. So if I had to guess, I'm willing to assume that this prism is what allows Mario to have this outline effect. But the prism itself is not supposed to be seen. That's supposed to remain invisible while it allows this effect to be cast over Mario. Now that's just armchair speculation. Please feel free to take it or leave it. But considering the fact that it follows Mario around and only follows Mario around when this effect is occurring, that is my best guess. I also want to take an opportunity to talk about the file select screen. What's really strange about this environment is that just over to the right, and because you can't manipulate the camera, you'll never see it. It's a unique dock that is never seen anywhere else in the game. Clearly, it was supposed to attach to the beach near Mario at a certain point, but they moved it away. For what reason? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it made the player think that they were supposed to be able to get over to the dock, and so it was frustrating testers or something. Again, there's no definitive answer here. And also, if we take the camera all the way out here, you can see how vast the environment is for the file select screen. Now, speaking of some really weird effects, we have this moment where Mario is going inside the Noki bottle, and he shrinks down to get inside. Well, doing this show long enough, I've realized that if any time there's a character that shrinks down or disappears or something like that, chances are there's something weird going on a technical level. So I took the time here to take a look at what Mario's doing in slow motion and from a different side to see how the model is affected. As it turns out, Mario turns into two Mr. Game & Watches. You can see a lot of his geometry gets flattened, but not all flattened to one side. It gets two sides, which is really funky. And for funny leftover stuff, we have Shadow Mario over here, who's waiting for Mario to trigger a cutscene. Now, you normally don't get close enough to see this, but if you pan the camera over to him while he's waiting for Mario, you can see that he's standing on top of a box. Now, after finding this for myself, I did some research, and I realized that someone else had found this prior, and they said that when you remove the box, it doesn't really affect how he stands on the spot. So technically, it's unnecessary for him to be standing on it, which leads me to believe that the only reason why this box is here is because at a certain point, the environment didn't either exist or it didn't function to allow things to stand on it. And so the box is there so the character could stand there temporarily while the game was in development. And for, I guess, the reason of it just didn't need to be removed because the player would never see it, the box was, in fact, never removed. And speaking of unused things left behind, in the very first area of the game inside this building here, there's a couple of vases and pots. It's very weird. Some of these things don't look like they're textured correctly, honestly, because one of them is a wicker basket texture. But the most peculiar thing that I found was one that looked like a pianta, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of strange. I wonder what the texture sheet for this looks like. And taking a look for it yielded some really interesting results. For one thing, the pianta texture is straight up a pianta. It's not even square. It has the outline of a pianta, and the developers just decided to slap that on a vase. Over to the far left of that, though, is another pianta with a star shirt, and I don't think that's ever used anywhere in the game at all. But one thing I know for certain isn't used anywhere in the game is this texture for a gyroid from Animal Crossing. And I'm gonna pass this once again over to the guys at Digino Gaming to talk about this a little bit.
The gyroid in particular is interesting, as it may have been a sly reference included in honor of Animal Crossing's scriptwriter Makoto Wada. Wada came to the rescue during Sunshine's development and helped write the dialogue for Delfino's residents.
Alright, once again, thank you guys. And with that said, why don't we do a zoom out of the blooper course, which very surprisingly has that sky dome that has stars and train tracks. Guess I wasn't expecting that. Alright, now let's take a look inside of Mecha Bowser. Now, obviously, inside of Mecha Bowser is supposed to be Princess Peach and Bowser Jr., but they would never go for the trouble of having those two characters inside the Mecha Bowser if you never had a really good chance to see them anyway. That would be the logic behind it at least, but it looks like there was an intention for you to see them at least at one point, because if you take the camera inside the head, you can see the control panel that is usually only visible in the cutscene, and even in the cutscene, it's a higher polygon version of this control panel. So what you're looking at here is an unused low poly version of the control panel, which I believe is a completely undocumented discovery here. Alright, now it's time to start talking about some of these critters, like the seagulls here. The seagulls in Mario Sunshine have red around their eyes, making them a little bit angry looking, to be honest with you. Then we got the little green birds here. The green birds are really interesting looking. They have a tuft of red and yellow feathers on top of their heads, as well as a white dash for their eyes, and the eyes themselves are yellow. And even the legs for their feet, for some reason, have some level of detail to them. They have black and yellow stripes. And then we got the bees. The bees, you know, kind of surprised me, because usually with small insects, they go with cardboard cutouts. And if you're not familiar with the term, it's kind of like flat textures that move around in a 3D environment. But these guys went the extra mile for the bees. Pausing the game here and taking the camera right up to its face can show you that it has a Mario World kind of aesthetic with its own set of cartoon eyes. And it's fully 3D modeled. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's start talking about stuff that's hidden out of bounds again. Now, a lot of you recognize this enemy here. It's littered throughout the entire game. Well, there's two things to talk about here. One thing is that inside of all these goopy prisms hides the piranha plant inside, and this is what it looks like when scrunched up in there. But even more interesting is that if you take the camera just below its geometry, you can see that the very bottom is just primary colors that seem to swap in and out. It always matches the color of the goop that they're textured with. So in this case, we got some pinks, we got some oranges, and we got some yellows. And also that prism that I was talking about with the piranha plant. Well, taking the camera down below the surface can show you that it's fully modeled. It's a full encasement. It's almost in the shape of a human heart, I'd say. And here's a crappy segue. Speaking of things encased in other things, we have this bell tower in Delfino Plaza, and if you take the camera inside the tower, there's an unused flood box. And also, in many maps of Super Mario Sunshine, you can find a volcano off in the distance, but what's really strange is that there's a detail to this volcano in most areas that the player never gets a chance to see, and that is inside the crater of the volcano is this small little hole that comes to a point. Normally, it would make more sense to just leave that completely unmodeled, and heck, it would probably be even easier to just have a pool of lava or something. I mean, it's a fantasy game after all. But to go for the extra effort of making this small little detail seems to imply that it was supposed to be shown to the player at some point. And also, here's a fun little fact. Outside the boundaries of a lot of the environments in Super Mario Sunshine is extra layers of geometry, textured completely blue, so it's a little hard to see the depth of the geometry, but it's like a second crust to whatever you're supposed to be looking at in the game itself. And why this is all here, I can only imagine is because if the player clips the camera through the environment, the developers don't want you to see the sky dome or maybe just empty environment, and possibly thought that this blue aesthetic would be a little bit more appealing and not break the illusion quite as much as, say, the void. Then we got the star of the show, a toad that was meant to be seen by the player, but due to technical goofs, he was cut out of the US version of the game. Now you can see this toad in your brand new Nintendo Switch version on Super Mario 3D All-Stars, but since we're covering the GameCube original, I just wanted to give you a look at something that's totally bizarre. Now there are various scenes to Super Mario Sunshine, and in each scene, all the residents on the island are placed in different parts of the island, and they have different types of dialogue. Now for this one scene where Bowser Jr. shows up with his little submarine, there's supposed to be a yellow toad here, but you can't see him, and it's because he clips through the map and just kind of ends up chilling out below the environment, out of bounds. And so if we move the camera directly above us, we can see the exact coordinate in which this toad is being placed, forever screaming for help in the void. So we gotta dedicate ourselves a large portion of the video to the very beginning of the game. Not because it's convenient in any sort of way, but just because it's heavily scripted. There's a lot of barred off areas, and it houses a unique scene. And that unique scene I'm referring to is Princess Peach's letter before the game starts. You see a picture of her against the moon before cutting away to Mario going to the Mushroom Kingdom. But what if I told you that picture is in fact floating underneath the lake in Mushroom Kingdom? And even more curious than that is a cube that's hanging behind that image, as well as another moon that seems to have no purpose. And I say this with confidence because if you look at the moon from a different angle on the original image, it doesn't lose its image or any of its effects. And just as cool as that, we have Mario hanging out in this scene before the camera cuts away to him walking to the Mushroom Kingdom. Right where you would normally take control of Mario is right where he is standing, despite the fact that when Mario is walking to the gate, that model is no longer there. Instead, we have some low poly toads that are also in a T-pose. Also, that gate that Mario just came through, what's behind there exactly? Well, in truth, not much. You have yourself a walking path that seems to connect into a triangle at the end. Now, even though the player isn't necessarily allowed to see the end of this triangle, this is a technique used by developers to give a sense of depth when you can't reach something like it. And since we're done with this spot here, let's do a zoom out of the entire Mushroom Kingdom. And while we're up here in the sky, let's ponder to ourselves another question. Is there anything behind Princess Peach's castle? In the pre-rendered cutscene, it implies that there's supposed to be a garden behind there. But if we were to take the camera back there, no matter what, even if we got Mario into the position, looks like the developers decided to save on resources and not model anything at all. Though, interestingly enough, if you take the camera below the surface, there is a mirrored image of the Mushroom Kingdom that doesn't seem to have all of its textures. But what it does have is some extra geometry that the actual Princess Peach castle doesn't have. It seems to imply here that there was supposed to be a window that, of course, the player wouldn't be able to reach. And is there anything else that we can find down here? Well, when Bowser invades the Mushroom Kingdom, he brings his airships along with him, and while the airships above ground seem to be pretty detailed, below ground, they, well, not so much. Now, if we take ourselves back above ground, this is a pretty huge discovery. Now, at no point in Mario Galaxy does the doors open to Princess Peach's castle. But if we were to take the camera inside the castle, you'd see a modeled and textured inner area. This implies that someone or something was supposed to walk out of this. Whether it be Mario himself to explore Princess Peach's castle, or just an NPC that was meant to open the doors and walk out. Either way, making these little walkthroughs is usually a very intended design choice. So what you see here is a relic of an idea that was scrapped. Now how about Princess Peach herself? You can see her way off in the distance, and as you try to get close to Princess Peach, it only triggers a cutscene to move the game along. But if we had the camera zoomed in on Princess Peach, you could see the good old low poly Peach moment. This terrifying little beauty is meant to save on resources by cutting down on the quality of textures as well as the amount of geometry on the character. Oh boy. Did you catch that? For some reason with this one scene in the Luma, when he goes to poke Mario's nose, the entire character is flattened and stretched out to better suit this one little scene. Speaking of flattened characters, I wanted to see what it looked like in that very moment when Mario is squished by a thwomp. Obviously, when Mario is squished by something, it's completely out of the player's view until you see the aftermath. But putting the camera in a very specific position can allow you to see the very moment in which Mario's character model starts to squish. Okay, let's talk about the baddies for a little bit. First of all, with this scene where Bowser comes into frame, I want to know where he comes from exactly. He doesn't just immediately blip into position, and he doesn't start from where you would think he would start. Instead, he seems to spawn right at the edge of the cliff, and then his character model is lifted into the correct position that then shows the descent that you are meant to see. Also, if we were to take the camera inside of Bowser's shell, we can see that the shell is completely detached from the body itself, meaning that if there was a way to remove the shell in some way, you could see all of Bowser's back. Alternatively, in this game in particular, if we were to remove everything but Bowser's shell, you could see that the shell is fully modeled on the front. And we can't forget about little old baby Bow Bow Jr., who we can confirm the same exact results for as well. A fully modeled back that the player will never be able to see. And how about those Koopas? Well, when you grab a Koopa shell, there's nothing inside of that shell. It's now just a regular Koopa shell. But when you initially jump on the Koopa and you don't pick it up, you might notice that there's a little tail hanging out of the back end of the shell. Well, taking the camera inside of the shell at this point shows you that the Koopa has all of its limbs and head crammed inside the shell legitimately. The head for some reason seems to shrink down, but the rest of his limbs stay the exact same size. That's why it looks like such a jumbled mess in there. Also, a detail that's very difficult to see on your own, although I suppose it is technically possible to do, is that the Magic Koopa's eyeglasses has a special texture on the inside of the glasses. Now, they don't have eyeballs, of course that's the first thing I wanted to check, but on the opposite side of the glasses that you normally see as the player is a darker blue shaded side to his glasses. Also, Dino Piranha starts off with an eggshell on top of his body, and if we take the camera inside of the eggshell, we can see it's somewhat similar to the Koopa, where the head is shrunken down to fit inside the geometry, and his little leafy limbs are kind of clipped into his body to just make the fit. Now I got two examples of the developers using objects to perform special functions within the game, but not allowing the user to know that they're using objects. The first example of this is the air bubbles in Beach Bowl Galaxy. In game, you're going to notice that the bubbles seem to just come out of the ground, but this function is tied to an object. So if we take the camera underneath the ground, we can see the little spouts that are actually pushing out the air. And the other one is a little bit more of a popular discovery. This is over in the first area of the game, and you'll notice that you can read Yoshi's door. Well, if you take the camera behind this door, you can see there's a signpost. As signposts are objects in Super Mario Galaxy that are meant to be read, the developers simply just put the signpost outside of the player's view so they didn't have to see that object. So when we take the camera inside of Mario's hat, we can see there's a little bit of hair underneath, but most of the top of his head is completely missing. That's not the unusual part. The thing that is kind of unusual is that when you play as Luigi, he has a full head of hair underneath his hat, but that head underneath is really strange looking. I guess I could see it going either way. Either you don't put hair underneath the hat so it doesn't clip through the hat, or you don't make the hair underneath the hat dynamic so that it doesn't clip through. But doing both? It caught me off guard, I gotta admit. So that low poly peach you saw at the start of the episode, yeah, that's actually something that a lot of fans from way back would probably recognize from the original video. That's not new to you. But ladies and gentlemen, I got a new attraction for you. Forget about low poly peach. Move over, sister. Now we got ourselves low poly Rosalina. This freak of nature has two forms. The first one is not that noticeable, but if you look at her nails, they seem to be elongated at least 4 times its original size. But then when you go to the even lower poly model, then it starts to look very similar to what it did with Princess Peach. The polygon counts are not kind to this one, and very surprisingly, if you take the camera inside of the bangs that are covering up her face, she still has an eyeball underneath, but there's missing textures, and the retina pupil part of her eye has a slant that makes it look like she's angry or something. Now this is something I thought was kind of neat. There's this really impressive effect that's used on fuzzy characters. It does a really good job of making you think that every character that is fuzzy is in fact fuzzy. But to pull that off on a Wii system and have it actually be individual hairs is, well, for lack of a better term, not possible. So then how is this achieved? Well, when you look at it from another angle, the answer becomes very clear. From its side, you can see the same texture, only layered up 5 different times. And as the layers get closer to the body, the more visible they become. And since they're all individual layers, they can move independently of each other, which from far away makes it look like it's fuzzy. A lot of the rooms inside of these pocketed zones have a very restricted camera. From what I can tell, the reason why they went with this choice is because a lot of them have a very contained space, so maneuvering the camera inside of it would be really tough. But then for an area like this one where it's so open and free, you gotta ask yourself, how far does it actually go? And shockingly, it goes quite a way. In fact, it looks a lot like Sonic the Hedgehog. It's very strange. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Womp King. The reason why we're looking at him today is because it turns out that when you defeat Womp King, he has an expression unique to himself. But because he's face down when you beat him, you don't get to see it. However, if we manipulate the camera below the stage, we can see that the Womp King loses a tooth, and he just, well, I don't really know what to make of his face there, but yeah, we'll just say that's the look of defeat. Oh no, hold on a second, I think I know what's going on here. I think he's shocked that he has a crack on his head now. So many of you already know what we're about to look at here, and I'm sure that many of you are hoping that we find something new about this discovery, but unfortunately there isn't, and I have to put it into the show because if I don't, everyone's going to be asking about it, understandably so. But for those that don't know already, in Shiverburn Galaxy, there are some really creepy figures staring at you from atop the cliffside. And who are these figures? Well, in the game's file system, they are listed as Hell Valley trees, and they don't serve any other purpose than to stare at you. One thing that I can tell you, unfortunately I can't show you, but I can confirm that, I always thought that they were walking along the cliffside the entire time, and that's why every time you went into the first person mode, you would see them. But in reality, your level is so small, and the cliffside is so big, that you're not traveling enough distance to ever escape them. But they are staying in that single spot the entire time. So right at the beginning of the game, we get to see a box full of carpenter tools to signify that they're going to be working on the Mario ship. But at no point do you ever get to see all of the contents of the box. Until now. If you look behind the box, there's some added rope. But inside the box, there's actually 2 wallpapers. Now these aren't just 2 random pieces of wallpaper. These are actually wallpapers, both used on the Mario ship itself later in the game. So the star wallpaper is used in the core room, and Lubba, I am loving the place. Love what you did with it. And the love carpeting is used to hone Kamek's magic powers. Don't know what I'm talking about? I'm making a reference to my Mario Kart episode. I probably shouldn't do that. Now, I bet you didn't put that much thought into the bonus rooms and where they would actually be when you're going through the levels. Well, baboom, baby! That'll get your brain juices flowing. You might even say that's one way to think outside the box. Ugh, it's the kind of pun that just hurts you the second you say it. So I really wanted to show off this next scene because when you give it a new perspective, you begin to really appreciate how beautiful the scenery is. As you can see in the background, it's waterfalls, all waterfalls. But when we take the camera all the way to one of the waterfalls, it becomes much more apparent that we are actually sitting inside of a dome of waterfalls that pours into a pool of giant water. Ugh, like seriously, that is some good imagination right there. I wish something like that existed on Earth. Here's a 2-for-1 deal. That floating box you're seeing right now belongs to Lubba. Anytime you talk to Lubba, there's always a floating box inside of his body at all times. But another thing that I happen to notice, Lubba actually has white around his eyes. And it looks like they changed this for promotional art. Because I looked at all the promotional art for Lubba, and he appears to have fully blue eyes. But in-game, if you really take a close look, he actually has white around his eyes. And in the medical field, that's called sclera. He has sclera, guys. Did I just teach you something? Did I just teach you something that you might be able to use in the real world? Well, good. I'm glad to know that deep down in my heart that people are going to be walking around in the world letting others know that Lubba has white around his eyes. So I had to point this out because when you first start the game, there's a PD Piranha Plant egg that you can crack open to start a boss battle. But I checked in there, there's no PD Piranha. But in this rematch fight at the end of the game, PD Piranha's walking around on the planet. But this time, PD is in there, and he's fully rendered. And as you can see, he's walking around very awkwardly. You know, I almost feel so embarrassed for him that cracking open his egg, he should be thanking me for that. I'm doing you a favor, buddy. Alright, I'm warning you right now, this is going to be a spoiler, so if you need to click out, please click out now. Anyway, after you beat the game, Rosalina finally shows up, talks for a little bit, and brings the hub world from Mario Galaxy 1 with her. And the detail that they put into this one little scene is immaculate. Almost. There is one aspect of this little hub world that the developers decided to be a little cheap on. As you may recall, the kitchen in Mario Galaxy has silverware and cups strewn about on the outside of the walls. Now don't get me wrong, I don't expect them to recreate every little utensil to make this look 100% to scale here. But what they decided to do is a little bit on the funny side. As you can see, they are protruding blocks that have bland colored silhouettes to represent the silverware and cups. Oh, I love it. I knew that was off. I had to check, and I do it. I do it. Alright, now why are we taking a look at Bao Bao today? It's because there's actually a very interesting discovery. Now, unfortunately, I have to do this within the confines of just moving the camera around, but Did you know that Bowser in Super Mario Galaxy 2 has his back fully rendered? Not his shell, the backside that wears the shell. So if you wanted to, you could rip the assets out of the game and have Bowser without his Koopa shell. Now I know it's a little hard to see, and I know it's a little disturbing, to be inside Bow's body. The Bow body. But I assure you, what you're looking at right now is the backside of Bowser's torso. And we're going to finish this episode off by taking a look at Princess Peach's castle. And at the very beginning of the game, no less. How poetic. So if we take a closer look at Princess Peach's castle in Mario Galaxy 2, we can see that the castle had a little bit of a redesign. Now that door below the stained glass window was added in Mario Galaxy 1. But below that is more stained glass windows above the main entrance. And what's really cool about this is that it's the same exact model used in Mario Galaxy, but they changed the textures of this particular archway to be stained glass windows instead. And another thing that they added as well, completely unique to Mario Galaxy 2 itself, is that these pointed rooftops, somebody please tell me what you're actually supposed to call these things. So first I want to talk about the cannon box. A cannon goes over your character's head, and the limbs or whatever power-up you have remains underneath the cannon box. So how is this effect pulled off? Well, the answer is hilariously, because if you take the camera inside, you can see that the head and limbs of your character still remain on your character model. They're just shrunken down to an absurd degree, so it doesn't clip into the cannon box. I had to look at all the character models just to see what sort of effects would happen with each sort of one. And one of the most interesting things that I found was that for the Tanuki power-up, the head is just severed from the body and floating above it, making something that was already very uncanny even more uncanny. And next up, I want to talk about Contour. Contour is a unique enemy in Super Mario 3D World who, believe it or not, has glasses. You might not know that. You might just suspect that that's just the character's eyes. But the only way you would know that for sure is if you were one of the players that decided to experiment with the touch feature of the game and tap on Contour to remove its glasses. This is something that a lot of players don't know. So I wanted to show that to you first off, but since this is Boundary Break, I'm also going to take the camera right up to its face so you get a good look at what its eyes are supposed to look like. And then this is a cool discovery, but it's kind of unfortunate because I can't get a great look at it. But inside of the bubble dome of the spaceship, there's an unused texture that reveals that the spaceship had a pair of eyes. Now there's multiple models of this ship that are used all over the overworld map. This is a more detailed version of that, and inside of those lower poly models, you don't see anything like this. Although this geometry is definitely bizarre and very unlike something you would see in a Mario game, I will admit that maybe it's not eyes, but it's definitely something that is layered on top of what you're seeing here. This isn't clipping of any kind. Anyways, moving on to Bowser. When you beat Bowser for the first time in the game, there's an animation where he falls down into the ground, only to be launched back out into the sky. And so taking the camera down to see what's going on with his character model is kind of funny. He goes through a whole somersault just to position the character model in the way that the animators wanted, and then he gets shot up into the sky. It's really fun to watch. Also, a lot of fans want to know about the Bowser's Fury model and how all that works when he gets shot into the sky. Is the model for Bowser always stored underneath the stage? Well, no, that's not the case. And when Bowser returns back into his shell form, that hibernation model is a separate model from the one that gets stored into the ocean. And so in certain instances, you can see a double up of the Bowser shell model if you have the camera angle just right. And let's talk about the opening cutscenes for both versions. Here's Bowser's Fury, and Mario gets sucked into the black goop. In order to pull that effect off, the developers just made a giant cylinder that Mario drops in, but it looks more like a warp from the perspective that the developers want you to see. And as for the opening cutscene for 3D World, as you know, Bowser actually pops out of the pipe and grabs one of the pixies. And until that happens, the model is stored underneath the map, and it is terrifying looking. The head is once again shrunken down super small, just like the characters for the cannon box. And once everything is said and done, you can see all the character models slink down further and further underneath the map after they jump into the pipe to pursue Bowser. Also, this is super cool. After the opening cutscene ends for Super Mario 3D World, there's a very brief moment where if you hang the camera in this spot, all the worlds load in at once, which is something that doesn't happen when you're actually in the game. So although it's not not the best camera angle. If you ever wanted to see what that would look like, you are looking at it right now. So let's talk about some of the hidden Luigis. Now I know that all of them have been found at this point, but some people wanted better looks at certain Luigis and they kind of wanted to know how some of them worked. Like for example, this Luigi that's all the way on top of this volcano. Normally he'd be really far off in the distance, but thanks to the camera that we have here, we can see exactly where he's placed and just how high quality the sprite is. Unlike the one that's cast against the moon in one of the last levels, his is blown up and looks a lot more blotchy. It's also not completely against the moon. It's actually some ways away from the moon. And now let's talk about Bowser's Fury for a little bit. As soon as Mario goes into the new world, he's upside down and his head is stuck in the ground. If you take the camera underneath, you can see that his eyes are wide open. It even blinks, so there isn't like some sort of pained expression that would be on his face, and that makes sense. The Nintendo developers are really smart about not accidentally putting in something that would not normally be seen by the player. And that's why this is the perfect segue for something that I don't normally see in Nintendo games. They left a dev cube in the game. Yeah, of course the player can't normally see this, and that's not the only one either. I managed to find one that was a little more suspicious. In this level here, you can see that if you take the camera all the way up, there's just one random cube above the geometry of the level. What this one's meant for, that would be even harder to guess than the Bowser one. But as for more developer techniques, we got this over here, a Super Mario Brothers classic. Platforms that are going up and platforms that are going down, and if you stand too long on the ones that are going up, you'll die. And if you stand on the platforms going down too long, you'll also die. Now, how is this effect pulled off in 3D World? Well, if you take the camera at this angle, you can see that the platforms are constantly reusing itself and are even operating behind the geometry of the level. There's no warping or anything, it just kind of runs on a pattern. And now I want to do a close-up on certain details that are just right in front of your face. Like for example, did you know that there are moths in Super Mario 3D World? Now the detail on these moths are not that impressive at all, but of course you never get a good close-up of any of these details. So to show you, this is what moths would look like canonically in the world of Super Mario. And moving on from that, there's a surprising level of detail on Mario's clothing. And what I've noticed is that this LOD just seems to kind of disappear as the game organically gets about as far away as you would imagine in 3D World. So it's not often you get to see these details, but there are denim stripes on Mario's overalls, as well as a cottony kind of look to his hat and shirt. The game also has these little crabs, and I just want to show you what this looked like up close. Pretty freaking adorable. Taking the camera behind it will give you a perfect sense of how this model looks at all angles. And then a lot of you were asking about Captain Toad over on Twitter, and they wanted to know if there was any details inside of his backpack, and sadly, not really. There is some geometry where the paper sticks out of the backpack that is inside the backpack, but there's no fine details that you can make out that would be particularly interesting. While talking about all this, once again, lots of cool bump map details on Captain Toad's model, just like Mario. I knew some of you guys are going to ask about these bosses here, and I wanted to show what happens when you take the camera underneath the level. There's not a lot that these models are hiding. In fact, the King and Queen here have less going on than the other models. And also I want to do a boundary break tradition and show you guys some birds. These ones in particular are a lot of fun. These are cat birds from Bowser's Fury. When's the next time I'm ever going to have an opportunity to talk about a bird on this show that has cat ears? I had to show you. I'm sorry. I'm sure you can forgive me. And then I want to show you some cool stuff, like for example, zoom in the camera out in the Toad house. We'll show you that the room is just housed inside of a sky dome. And there's some dolled up areas in the game that I'm sure a lot of people want to know, is there more details to it? And the masterminds at Nintendo, as per usual, did a fantastic job setting up an illusion for you, because once you break the camera off its axis, you'll see that very little is modeled outside the player's view. Same can be said for Bowser's Castle and World Castle, although that Bowser shell-shaped dome is fully modeled, surprisingly. And in the final world, oh my goodness, it's so beautiful. And of course, once again, once you take the camera off its axis and start going behind the buildings, almost nothing is fully modeled except for Bowser here, who has pretty much everything modeled except for his legs. This model of Bowser does not follow the model guide that Nintendo seems to have for Bowser, where if you take the camera inside of his shell, in almost any game you can think of, he has a fully modeled back inside of the shell, which yes, is the case for the alive models of Bowser in this game. Also want to take this camera up and around this boss arena, as the camera is usually very limited, but if you take the camera around, you can see there's raised edges to the lava, maybe for some reason to prevent the player from traveling too far outside the map somehow. But beyond that is the rest of the square that the developers placed for the lava texture. Also, because how many opportunities am I going to have to show you all these zoom outs? I want to show you another one I thought was particularly cool that has a lot of vegetation that's a little harder to see outside the boundaries. And a lot of fans wanted me to pan the camera out for these moving sections like trains or Bowser's militia. And unfortunately, I can't pan the camera too far back before everything starts to disappear. But here's a nice little tour of that here. And in fact, since everything has to move in a straight line, despite the fact that there's this bend in the road, if you take the camera all the way back here, you can see that the model just sort of drives over the air. And another thing I wanted to show you is that taking the camera around in this level in particular is really satisfying, because for some reason there's a wall that the player can't see, and also the ocean has sort of like a waterfall effect. It's kind of interesting. Again, you can't really see this on your own, but it's really fun to look at. Also, I wanted to show you how bonus rooms work in this game. This one's for an overworld map, and if you take the camera out, you can see where it's placed in conjunction with World 5. And the same for the first world. There's a bonus area stored off to the left of where you spawn in the level. So the first thing I want to talk about is T-poses, because I learned a lot about how this game operates by finding T-poses. And I'm going to reveal my deductive reasoning as we go along here. So with this first image, you can see that all the band members are in a T-pose with their instruments sitting at the bottom of their feet. Now that's really interesting, and how I managed to find this was I started up the scenario, and with a little bit of walking around, I activated the camera and took it all the way to the top of the building here to find this. But then I discovered something. The T-poses are based off of how long you've had the map out before you go into camera mode, which freezes the game. So I tried it again, only I tried to do it as fast as I could. And I'd say about maybe 4 to 8 frames managed to squeak through before I was able to push the button. And by doing that, I managed to get the entire crowd here to, I guess, be in a T-pose as well. I've never seen so much intimidating dominance in my entire life, but boy is that a treat. Okay. So whatever is well outside the player's view is loading in the animations for all these character models a little bit later than when you load the map itself. And so I tested this all out to see how many T-poses I could possibly find. One of which being that I really wanted to see if I could get a Pauline T-pose. But unfortunately, she never gets a T-pose, at least not on frame 1 when you can load this map. And the reason for that is that her model is frozen on the first frame of her animation when she gets called into the cutscene. But if you skip that cutscene as fast as possible, then go into camera mode as fast as possible, she still won't be in the T-pose, a little disappointing, but you will find her in a position she's not supposed to be in. When she first gets loaded into the map, she's not on top of the stage, but instead she's underneath it. And the pose that she's in is frame 1 of the animation that would play during that cutscene. And the same thing's going to happen in other maps as well. Taking the camera out on frame 1 of the Wooded Kingdom can show you a fire brother also in a T-pose. But not only that, it shows you all the things that can be attached to the model as well, which we'll talk about in just a second. But for this model, you can see that his hat's still there, but the hair is there too because it's bleeding through the hat. And the Mario mustache that would come into play if Mario was to capture him is also on his face, even though we clearly have not captured him yet. This is because these are all the possible objects that can be attached to this model. And when a animation is not assigned to the model yet, not only do you get a T-pose, you get all the available accessories to the model as well. Which brings us to the Lost Kingdom. Here you go, you got another T-pose for the Koopa. But let's revisit that idea that the character models also share all their accessories in their unloaded model and take it over to the bird here. Now you might remember, and if you don't, I'm going to show you this animation right now, that the bird can squawk and unhinge its jaw essentially to have a very exaggerated animation. Well, the exaggerated part of its mouth is a separate accessory to the model. And so with the character model unloaded here, you can see both versions of the bird overlapping each other at once. It's very weird looking, right? Well, to top off our T-posing tirade here, I'm going to show you the cream of the crop. A very popular character in the Super Mario franchise, Princess Peach, can be seen in a T-pose as well. Both these character models show you every frame of the eyelid, which makes it look frankly disturbing. You can send your memes here if you have anything good to share. I might retweet you. But not only that, but with Princess Peach, you get a nice T-pose as well. Rounding out to probably the most amount of T-poses I've ever seen on this show, if you count every single character in that crowd there. Another example is Donkey Kong himself. Just like I mentioned before, if you can load the map before the first few frames get out, all the frames of animation for Donkey Kong load all at once, and they all stack on top of each other, fighting for that Z-axis. I ended up posting this to Twitter and I got some really funny responses, so I'm just gonna list off a few here. YouTuber Arlo says, just as nature intended. Tokenyo says, like those old Game & Watch games where you turn it on and all the parts light up. Gaming Dominari says, he looks like some meat abomination from Resident Evil. Lots of people seem to think he looks like a spider, like for example Reagan here. Baru says, it looks like he had an allergic reaction to himself. But anyways, with that segment out of the way, let's do a zoom out of the Luncheon Kingdom. Okay, let's talk about low poly models. Sometimes in this game there are models that are not affected by level of detail. And to put level of detail into layman's terms, games oftentimes will have like a really low poly model way off in the distance, and then when you start to get closer and you're able to have the human eye recognize more details, a more quality version of that model is then replaced. But in Mario Odyssey, there are some things that are always going to be far away, and so they're always low poly. Pretty much anything that has a sail out in the sky is almost always going to stay low poly, like the Sphinx here, as well as the cabs off in the distance in New Donk City. In fact, the one that's attached to the sail has a different model from the ones that are on the bridge. So this guy right here has a little bit more detail than the other guys, and taking the camera over to the taxis on the bridge, like I said, can show you that it's even more low poly. Then we got a low poly environment too. Like the Cap Kingdom here, you can see way off in the distance, it shows a very small glimpse of the Cascade Kingdom. Now if we take the camera over there, you can see that this environment is really low poly. It isn't modeled on all sides, which is very typical for far off environments. An immediate example that I can show you right here and right now is that in Cap Kingdom, all the buildings that make up the background are also just 2D textures. So for Cascade Kingdom to have any 3D depth whatsoever is actually more effort than they really need to put into. And then there's the human models in New Donk City. Now I was starting to get really disappointed. I thought I wasn't going to be able to show you guys these low poly models that were very clearly out in the background. But thankfully, in this one area, you can see two different types of low poly models for these characters. Some have the jaggy hands and really primitive low-grade textures to represent the face. Then sometimes you get these guys with slightly higher polygon counts who have claws for hands and no eyes. I find that in particular to be really interesting. You'd think that there would at least be eyeballs so that you can't see the backdrop through their face. But I suppose without having eyeballs, you do save a little bit on resources. Put them all together with no joints whatsoever, so their arms just turn super duper skinny and stuff, and you have an ensemble of pure terror. And the last low poly model that I want to show you is actually attached to a very high poly model. It's a weird hybrid. The dragon atop the ruined kingdom is both. Something I've never seen in my life. The part that you're meant to see is incredibly detailed. I think we all were very impressed by how amazing that dragon looked. And I assumed, as well as probably many of you assumed, that there would be a separate low poly model off in the distance, and the model up close would just not have a lower half body, especially because the environment designers made it in such a way that you can't see below the cloud line. That's a pretty common technique to just hide the fact that there would be nothing to see down there. However, it does turn out that if you take the camera down there, you can see a weird hazy body. I guess this is also another failsafe if somehow, some way you managed to break the camera on your own and was to somehow see his body, but there is a reason why his body is masked in heavy amounts of fog, because they're using the same body that is used way off in the distance in a scene like this. It's a low poly model, and if you were to take the camera up close to its body like you would to its head, you'd see that it's a lot more blotchy, and there's a lot less rigidness to it. Obviously, this is to save on resources, allowing the game to run totally smooth. And since we're already in the Ruined Kingdom, why don't we show you a zoom out of what a Ruined Kingdom would look like. Like with most large environments, it's just a huge circle, but what's really cool too is that there's mountains that you can't even really see in-game. They seem to span pretty far well outside the Sky Dome itself. But anyways, with that said, yeah, here, take a good look at this entire environment. It's kind of nice because you get to see the dragon in the center there. Now let's talk about birds. Well, actually, first we should probably talk about these bats. Out of all the 3D birds, these bats seem to be the lowest quality out of the entire game. They don't have any eyes, they don't really have a mouth or anything. It's just a 3D shape that resembles a bat, so I would dub this the least interesting. Now, we're not going to go over every single bird that's in the game because I think there's different birds for every single kingdom. But here in the Metro Kingdom, there are pigeons, essentially, clearly trying to remain in line with the New York aesthetic. But what's cool about the pigeons in New Donk City is that the birds that are way off in the distance are 2D textures. And if you were to take the camera behind the 2D texture, it flips upside down for some reason. Another really cool fact about these textures is that there is one frame out of this animation where there's some artifacts left behind by the artist. Then in the Mushroom Kingdom, we have these white birds with these cute little eyes. They're very pudgy and, you know, they got a little tuft on the top of their head, almost like the tip of an ice cream cone. And the rest is fairly easy to see thanks to camera mode, so I'm not going to focus on this too much. Instead, we're going to move on here so I can show you some things that you can't see yourself. Everything you're about to see here is unused, or at least unseen and used in the game. Starting out with the final battle with Bowser. The background elements seem to be a whole bunch of cubes, but if you were to take the camera outside of those physical 3D cubes, there's a sky dome behind all of that, and that sky dome is never seen by the player. At least not here. It is used in one other place and it is visible, and that's against this boss here. But now we're going to talk about the mystery of the hexagon. I couldn't find this hexagon object in any other place in Mario Odyssey. The only place I could find it was Seaside Kingdom, and its two locations don't really have any consistency to what's above them. You can find one underneath the Sphinx, and that's just below the staircase, and I did have the Sphinx move just to see if it would move with the Sphinx. That wasn't the case. And then the other one I was able to find was over by this volleyball net, and this hexagon here has a really bright light attached to it, which again is really odd. And then, unlike any other doorway in the entire game, the doorway for the Toad ships seem to have a weird texture at the end of the doorway. Seems to be a metallic arch of some way. It's very strange. Totally gives me Rayman vibes, but I don't think it serves any purpose. I think it's just weird artifacts that the artist left behind. Also, I know it's not in the right category, but I do want to mention this one last T-pose that I found. In New Donk City, there is a resident that is in a T-pose and even has a Mario mustache. Once again, figuring out all the things that we've learned up to this point, he has the mustache because every single resident should have every accessory available to them. But we all know that not every single resident can be captured by Mario. In fact, it's very rare. And the only ones that ever do get captured by Mario have blonde hair, not black. This was the only resident that I could find that was in a T-pose in the main area. Specifically, this NPC just tells you about the action guide. Over here with Bowser, if you take the camera inside of his shell, you can see that he has a fully modeled back. And this is something that's old news. I actually once did a whole video chronicalizing the entire history of Bowser's unused back. And taking a small clip from that video can show you what it would look like if we remove the shell outright. Why they still do this to this day, I have no idea. And then if we use the coin filter, which allows you to see all the bump mapping in the entire game, you can see an unused texture for the taxis. Only ever seen on the broken down taxis. You can see at one point the license plate was supposed to read 6258-ND, and was later changed to 1981. A significant year that represents the birth of Donkey Kong. And then there's the recreation of the Mario 1 stage. It was really impressive. I was not expecting it, to be honest with you. But the way they pull it off is a little bit tricky. So, first of all, I just want to say that outside the boundaries of the theater room is the whole stage to Mario 1. And then when you start the quote-unquote game, the entire stage gets pulled over to the projection screen. And this is still all being pulled off in the Mario Odyssey engine, of course, so there's certain things that are outside the boundaries that you can't see. And these aspects are used to imitate some of the stuff that you see in the original Mario game. Like, for example, you cannot walk in this direction, the left. And so what they do to compensate for that is that they added in elements from Mario 1 to make a giant wall. And the underground area is literally underground. It is down below the original area, and all of these elements are hidden by the game's curtain. Also, I want to take this as an opportunity to mention that some of this footage, like the one you're looking at here, was made possible by using Jasper's NoClip website. Most of what we could look at in this game was done with the camera that I mentioned earlier. But in those rare cases, it didn't really quite do the job. Jasper's website managed to get us covered. And as we move on to the next scene, here is a zoom out of the Lake Kingdom. Okay, now it's time to talk about developer techniques. Towards the end of the game, there's this scene here where you can break down a series of walls. And because this object is completely unique to itself and is never able to be seen at all angles, if you take the camera behind it, you can see that it's not fully modeled. And because of the way that the cracks are angled, you can still see some of its depth. But that's just the boring stuff. Let's start getting into some of the more interesting developer techniques. Like this one here with the giant crowd that goes through the submap area. Now the way this works is that there is a set number of models here. And every time the model goes through that doorway, the coordinates of that model just gets transported to the opposite end. And this can be proven by showing you the frames just before it hits that target point and showing you exactly which models show up on the opposite end, which is the exact same ones. The biggest anomaly, of course, is this character here. He consistently looks the way he does and he stands in this one place and he's never seen by the player. Now it's hard to determine what purpose he serves, if any, but it would be a safe theory to assume that the programming of the warp coordinates is mapped to this character model. Another fun thing to look at is how the waves are pulled off in this submap here. How is the effect pulled off? Well, taking the camera outside the boundaries can show you that it's just one giant object that gets pushed forward. And within the confines of those walls, it gives the illusion of a body of water having a ripple effect. But like I said, it's more like one giant ribbon that's just kind of being shoved through the map. And this was pretty crazy too. All over New Donk City are a whole bunch of unused doorways. Now it seems like all the residential doors seem to have an unused doorway. Pretty surprising, there's nothing available to the player organically that allows you to see the other side of these doors, so really all of this is a bunch of needless geometry. And it's not even consistent. Some of the doorways are completely different from others, and the glass office-y kind of doors almost never have a doorway. Except for in rare cases like this one here. And keeping inside of New Donk City, also well outside the boundaries, you can see a really cool, interesting idea that the developers put in place. Possibly to save on loading, but if you were to take the camera way out into the western part of the map, you can find the concert hall to New Donk City. And yeah, the location for this concert hall is here at all times. Because if you were to go inside the building and then have Mario be there, taking the camera outside the concert hall will show you that all of New Donk City is still there. It's just that the lighting has been changed. And I also found this to be pretty uncommon, but I found it here in the cathedral. The entire map for the inside of the cathedral is also housed inside of a prism that the player can't see. And if we take ourselves inside of the Mushroom Kingdom, it's going to be something that's a little underwhelming, but it's still kind of cool to check out. At first it looks like nothing, but in the dead center of the castle, there for some reason appears to be a hole in the water layer. It's really weird. It's a perfect circle and everything. And you can see the rigidness of the waves on the edges of the circle. And like I exampled earlier in the episode, you might notice that most of the time when things are off in the distance, they end up being 2D textures. Makes sense. Easier to produce, much less taxing on resources. Player will never reach it to ever find out. So what do you think about this right here? Do you think the Earth is flat? Well, I'm very happy to let you know that that's not the case here. The Earth is an entire sphere. Takes a long time to get over here, so I gotta do a jump cut just to get the camera at a separate angle. But way off in the distance, you can see that there is an effect to kind of give it that outline glow. But from this angle, it's more like a ring. And the planet itself is uncompromisingly massive and fully modeled.